The unseen current. Elias Thorne had always considered himself a man of methodical habits, his life a carefully catalogued collection of facts and predictable rhythms. His profession, a rare book restorer, suited him perfectly. He thrived in the quiet solitude of his workshop, the scent of aging paper and leather a familiar comfort, the delicate work of repairing frayed spines and mending brittle pages a meditative balm. So, when the letter arrived, bearing the creased seal of a distant relative he'd barely known existed, informing him of an inheritance, an ancestral home in the secluded heart of the Catskills, it was less an opportunity and more a disruption. The Hawthorne House, as it was grandly called, stood like a forgotten sentinel amidst a sprawling wilderness of gnarled oaks and pines. Its clapboard exterior, once a crisp white, had weathered to a melancholic gray, peeling in places like sunburnt skin. The gables sagged, and the intricate gingerbread trim, once a testament to Victorian elegance, now merely hinted at former grandeur, shadowed by the encroaching forest. Elias remembered the estate agent's strained smile, a professional mask barely concealing a palpable desire to be anywhere else. "It's got character," she'd offered, her gaze darting towards the upper windows, opaque with years of grime. Elias, however, saw past the decay. He saw history, a vast, untouched library of stories waiting to be deciphered, much like the ancient texts he painstakingly restored. He saw potential, a vast, quiet space for his workshop, far from the city's ceaseless hum. He moved in during the late autumn, the air already possessing a biting chill that promised a long, harsh winter. The house, even after extensive cleaning and the installation of a new, albeit temperamental furnace, retained a pervasive, almost sentient coldness. It wasn't merely a lack of heat, it was a sensation that seemed to emanate from the very stones, a deep, ancient chill that settled into the marrow. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight, a constant symphony of complaint, and the wind, when it swept through the valley, whistled through unseen cracks, creating phantom voices that danced at the periphery of hearing. He'd initially found these quirks charming, the house's personality asserting itself. His first few weeks were consumed by the monumental task of unpacking and setting up his studio. Boxes of delicate tools, archival paper, and various glues filled the vast, echoing rooms. The library, a cavernous space on the second floor with tall, mullioned windows overlooking the wild garden, became his sanctuary. It was here, surrounded by the faint, comforting scent of old paper and dust motes dancing in shafts of weak sunlight, that Elias began to notice the other things. It started subtly, as most unsettling things do, a faint metallic tang in the air, like old pennies left out in the rain, that would dissipate as quickly as it appeared. He'd attributed it to the house's plumbing, or perhaps a lingering scent from some long-forgotten chemical spill. Then there was the temperature. He'd be working diligently at his large oak desk, carefully mending a torn folio, when a sudden, localized drop in temperature would occur. Not a draft from a window, he'd sealed them all meticulously, but a distinct pocket of icy air that would drift across his workspace, prickling the hairs on his arms. It was like walking into a cold spot in an old crypt, a sudden, inexplicable chill in an otherwise ambient room. He'd shiver, pull his wool cardigan tighter, and dismiss it as the vagaries of an old, inefficient heating system. One evening, deep in the throes of a particularly challenging restoration, the silence of the Hawthorne house seemed to deepen, to become something oppressive, almost liquid. He was hunched over a medieval illuminated manuscript, the intricate gold leaf shimmering under the soft glow of his desk lamp. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper brushed past his ear, a sound like dry leaves skittering across a vast, empty floor. Elias paused, hand hovering over the delicate page. He cocked his head, listening. Nothing. Only the distant hoot of an owl and the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the hall below. He shook his head, a wry smile touching his lips. Overworked Elias, he chided himself, the house settling, the wind. But the whispers began to recur, always faint, always just at the edge of audibility, like someone murmuring behind a thick velvet curtain. He'd catch fragments, indistinct and meaningless, yet unsettling in their very presence. Sometimes it sounded like a sigh, sometimes a drawn-out consonant, a soft, sibilant hiss. He found himself pausing more often, listening intently, his heart quickening with an inexplicable unease. He'd walk through the house, meticulously checking windows and doors, half expecting to find a breach, a rational explanation for the sounds that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. There was never anything, only the quiet, expectant emptiness of the old house. The physical manifestations followed, equally subtle at first. He had a habit of aligning his books on the shelves with obsessive precision, each spine flush, each edition categorized. One morning, he found a volume of Emerson, which he'd been consulting the previous day, pulled out a good inch from the others. He frowned, certain he'd reshelved it properly. He attributed it to a momentary lapse of memory, a fleeting distraction. But then, a few days later, a stack of blank archival paper on his desk, carefully weighted down, was found slightly askew, a single sheet lying on the floor. No open windows, no drafts, just the inexplicable shift. His sleep, once deep and untroubled, began to fray at the edges. He'd wake in the dead of night, not from a nightmare, but from a profound sense of presence. It was a feeling, not a sight or a sound, an acute awareness that he was not alone in the vast, silent house. The air in his bedroom, usually warm from the furnace, would become thick with that familiar, inexplicable chill. He'd lie rigid, eyes wide open in the oppressive darkness, straining to hear something, anything that would betray the source of his disquiet. Sometimes he thought he could hear a faint, almost imperceptible dragging sound from the hallway, like silk rustling against old wood, or a bare foot scuffing the floorboards. But when he finally dared to throw back the covers, heart hammering against his ribs, and ventured out, flashlight in hand, there was never anything but the cold, empty expanse of the corridor. The sense of being watched became a constant companion. He'd be in the kitchen, making his morning coffee, and feel an unmistakable gaze upon his back, a prickling sensation on his skin that would send a shiver down his spine. He'd spin around, expecting to see nothing, just the antique china cabinet reflecting the weak morning light, the shadows of the morning sun playing tricks among the old furniture. He started leaving lights on in rooms he wasn't actively using, a wasteful habit he'd always disdained, simply to banish the pools of darkness that seemed to harbor unseen eyes. One particularly gray afternoon, as rain lashed against the library windows, Elias was painstakingly sorting through a box of old photographs he'd found in the attic, faded sepia images of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to hold secrets. He felt a light, feather-like touch on the back of his neck, so fleeting he initially dismissed it as a fly or a stray thread. But then it happened again, distinct and undeniable, a lingering pressure, cold and delicate, tracing a path down his spine. His breath hitched, he froze, every nerve ending screaming. He slowly reached up, his fingers brushing the spot. Nothing, no insect, no thread, just the ghost of a sensation, a memory of an impossible touch. He scrambled to his feet, knocking over the box of photographs, their contents scattering across the dusty floorboards. His heart pounded, a frantic drum in his chest. He backed away from the desk, his eyes wide, scanning the empty room. The air had grown heavy, thick with that metallic scent, and an undeniable, profound chill. He spent the rest of the day in a state of agitated denial, meticulously cleaning the library, rearranging every book, every ornament, as if imposing order could somehow banish the growing disorder in his mind. He told himself it was stress, the isolation, the sheer unfamiliarity of the old house. He was rational, a man of science and logic, not susceptible to fanciful notions of ghosts or spirits. Yet the memory of that touch persisted, a cold, phantom sensation that refused to be reasoned away. That night, Elias tried to establish a semblance of normalcy. He brewed a strong tea, put on some classical music, Bach, something precise and orderly, and settled into his armchair in the living room, a thick blanket wrapped around him. He picked up a book, a treatise on medieval bindings, hoping to immerse himself in its familiar complexities. But his concentration was fractured. He found himself listening, straining to differentiate the creaks of the old house from the rustling of the fire in the hearth, from the imagined sounds that seemed to whisper just beyond his hearing. Then it happened. The music, a delicate cello solo, suddenly stuttered, a jarring skip in the melody, then resumed. Elias frowned, looking at the old record player he'd inherited with the house. He'd had it serviced, knew it was reliable. He watched the needle, perfectly tracking the groove. A moment later, it skipped again, a fraction of a second, but enough to break the flow, to catch his attention. He got up, walked over, and inspected it. The record was clean, the needle steady. As he leaned closer, a profound shiver ran through him. The air around the turntable was intensely cold, far colder than the rest of the room. It was like sticking his hand into a freezer. And then he heard it. Closer this time, distinct and unmistakable, a soft exhalation, like a sigh right beside his ear, carrying with it that faint metallic tang. Elias stumbled backward, knocking against a small side table, sending a ceramic coaster clattering to the floor. His breath caught in his throat, his heart thundering against his ribs, not with fear, but with a sudden, overwhelming certainty. It wasn't the house settling, it wasn't his imagination, it wasn't the wind. Something was here, something unseen, unheard, yet undeniably present, and it was no longer content to merely whisper from the shadows. It was making itself known. And Elias Thorne, the man of logic and reason, felt a terror bloom in his chest, cold and absolute, far deeper than any chill the old house could conjure. He was not alone, and whatever shared the Hawthorne house with him, it was beginning to stir. The silence that followed was not empty, it was laden with a palpable, expectant dread. The ceramic coaster shattered against the polished oak floor, its fragments skittering into the dim corners of the living room. Elias stood frozen, his back pressed against the cold stone of the fireplace, eyes wide with a terror that clawed at his throat. The faint, metallic tang in the air was now acrid, like rust and old blood. The sigh, so close, so undeniably real, had not been a figment of his overtaxed mind. It had been a breath exhaled by something that occupied the same space as him, something unseen but acutely present. His rational mind, that meticulously ordered library of logic and reason, buckled under the weight of the impossible. Ghosts, spirits, these were the stuff of pulp novels, not the grim reality of a Catskills autumn. Yet the cold, the touch, the whispers, the shifting objects, the sudden impossible skip of the record player, they coalesced into an undeniable, terrifying truth. He was not alone. He spent the remainder of the night huddled in his armchair, a heavy wool blanket pulled tight around him, a small antique lamp casting a weak circle of light against the oppressive darkness. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind rattling the windows was magnified into a monstrous crescendo. He dared not move, dared not even breathe too loudly, convinced that any sound, any movement would draw its attention. The silence, when it returned, was not a comfort but a threat, a vast, waiting emptiness. He drifted in and out of a fitful, shallow sleep, plagued by fragmented images. A flicker of movement at the edge of his vision, a long skeletal finger tracing patterns on his skin, a voice, deep and guttural, whispering syllables he couldn't quite grasp. Morning brought no reprieve, only a gray, watery light that seemed to leach the color from the world. Elias felt hollowed out, his muscles aching from the tension of the night. His first instinct was to flee, to pack a bag and drive until the Hawthorne house was a distant, nightmarish memory. But something held him back, a stubborn refusal to be driven from his home, a desperate need to understand, to rationalize the irrational. He started systematically searching the house. Room by room, he moved with a frantic energy, peering into shadows, throwing open closets, as if he expected to find a hidden squatting vagrant, a logical explanation for the growing madness. He checked the attic, the cellar, the locked shed outside. Nothing, only dust, cobwebs, and the echoing silence of an old house. The futility of his search only deepened his despair, cementing the terrifying truth that what he sought was not of this world, not bound by its rules. As the days bled into weeks, the entity's presence became less subtle, more insistent. The whispers intensified, losing their indistinct quality. He began to discern fragments of language, though never a full sentence, never a name. They sounded like a dry rustle, a faint papery crackle, as if ancient, brittle pages were being turned in a vast, unseen tome. Sometimes it sounded like a sigh of profound weariness. Other times, a quick, sharp intake of breath, a sound of anticipation. They would emanate from directly behind him, from the empty chair across the room, from the very walls themselves. The cold spots no longer drifted, they converged. Elias would be working at his desk, and the air around him would suddenly drop to an Arctic chill, a palpable, freezing shroud that would wrap around him, seeping into his clothes, chilling his bones. It was a cold that felt unnatural, devoid of humidity, dry and sharp, like the breath of something ancient and unliving. He started wearing multiple layers indoors, even keeping his hat on in the library, a desperate, futile attempt to ward off the encroaching chill. Then came the sounds of movement, faint at first, like the dragging of cloth or the soft scuff of a slipper across the floorboards, but soon they grew bolder. Elias would hear distinct footsteps ascending the grand staircase, heavy and measured, as if a weighty presence was making its way to the second floor. He'd hear them overhead, pacing in the empty guest bedroom, the cadence slow and deliberate. He'd rush up, flashlight in hand, to find the room pristine, untouched, yet the lingering chill and the faint echoes of the footsteps seemed to mock his desperate search. One evening, while preparing a simple meal in the kitchen, Elias heard a distinct thump from the living room, followed by a series of smaller clatterings. His heart leaped into his throat. He grabbed the cast-iron skillet, its weight a meager comfort, and crept towards the living room doorway. He peered inside. The antique grandfather clock, which had stood sentinel in the corner for decades, its pendulum frozen, was now leaning precariously, its heavy oak body having shifted several inches from the wall. Scattered around its base were the ceramic fragments of the coaster he had shattered weeks prior, which he had meticulously swept into a small pile beneath the clock, intending to discard them. Now they were spread across the rug, as if someone had deliberately kicked them. The entity was no longer content with mere suggestions. It was actively manipulating its environment, demonstrating a physical agency that chilled Elias to his core. He didn't just feel watched anymore, he felt toyed with. The psychological toll was immense. Elias, once meticulous and disciplined, became gaunt and disheveled. His once sharp mind, accustomed to the precise logic of restoration, was now a whirlwind of paranoia and exhaustion. He ceased working on his books, the delicate pages seeming to vibrate with an unseen energy, the silent library now a menacing space. He ate sparingly, slept even less. The shadows in the house seemed to deepen, to coil and writhe at the edges of his vision. He found himself talking aloud, arguing with the empty air, pleading for explanations, for peace. "What do you want?" he'd whisper into the pervasive chill, his voice raspy from disuse. "Why are you here? Leave me be!" His pleas were met with only the unsettling silence, punctuated by an occasional whisper that seemed to mock his desperation. One afternoon, a particularly heavy rainstorm lashed against the Hawthorne house, the wind howling through the gables like a banshee. Elias was in the kitchen, trying to distract himself by making a pot of strong coffee. He had left his small leather-bound journal on the kitchen table, where he occasionally jotted down observations about the house, a desperate attempt to document his descent into madness, to prove to himself that he wasn't simply hallucinating. As the coffee machine gurgled, a faint scratching sound began. Elias froze, his hand hovering over the sugar bowl. The sound seemed to emanate from the table, from the journal. He slowly turned, his eyes fixed on the aged leather. The scratching continued, a deliberate, rhythmic sound, like a fingernail dragging across a rough surface. He took a hesitant step closer, his breath held tight in his chest. The journal lay open, not to a blank page, but to one where he had scrawled his name and the date of his arrival. And there, etched roughly into the delicate paper, across the precise lines of his own handwriting, were a series of symbols. Not words, not letters he recognized, but sharp, angular markings, like crude runes, almost violently carved into the paper, tearing slightly at the surface. They were alien, disturbing, and utterly, terrifyingly deliberate. The scratching stopped. The air around the table plummeted to an unbearable cold, a sharp, piercing chill that stung his exposed skin. And then, clearer than any whisper he had heard before, a voice, dry and raspy, like ancient parchment tearing, resonated through the kitchen. It wasn't a human voice, not truly. It was a collection of sounds, a guttural breath, a sibilant hiss, a low, resonant hum, coalescing into something that was undeniably a word. Elias. His own name, spoken by the unseen, spoken with a chilling finality that left no room for doubt or denial. Elias stumbled backward, knocking over his coffee mug, its steaming contents scalding his hand, though he barely registered the pain. The journal lay on the table, the crude symbols stark against the delicate paper, a tangible, terrifying message from the invisible entity. It knew his name. It was no longer a passive observer, no longer a mischievous poltergeist. It was actively engaging him, marking his possessions, speaking his name. This was a presence with intent, with purpose, and Elias Thorne, a man whose life had been built on order and reason, was utterly, terrifyingly exposed. The rain outside seemed to scream, and the old house, no longer just a backdrop to his fear, had become a cage. He was trapped, and the entity had finally broken its silence, drawing him into a dialogue he never wanted. The true horror, he realized, had only just begun. Part 3. The scalding coffee spilled over Elias's hand, a searing pain that was a mere flicker against the absolute terror that had taken root in his soul. Elias. The word, a collection of dry rustles and guttural breaths, hung in the air, a physical weight that pressed down on him, suffocating. He was trapped, and the entity had finally broken its silence, drawing him into a dialogue he never wanted. The true horror, he realized, had only just begun. He stumbled back further, his gaze fixed on the journal, on the crude, violent symbols etched into the paper. His name. It knew his name. It was no longer a phantom. It was a hunter, and he, its prey.
For a long moment, Elias simply stood, paralyzed, the hot coffee dripping from his fingers, the rhythmic drip, 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 echoing in the profound silence that followed the entity's utterance. He wanted to scream, to run, but his limbs felt like lead, rooted to the spot. The air in the kitchen remained thick with that acrid metallic tang, and the cold was no longer localized to the table. It had spread, engulfing the entire room, a tangible, suffocating presence. When his breath finally returned, it was a ragged gasp.
He snatched up the journal, his fingers trembling as they traced the jagged lines of the symbols. They felt rough, almost alive under his touch, imbued with a malevolent energy. He didn't understand them, but their intent was clear. A message, a claim. He clutched the journal to his chest, as if its physical presence could ward off the unseen. The ensuing days blurred into a waking nightmare. Elias abandoned all pretense of normalcy, his life now a frantic, desperate dance around the entity's increasing aggressions. Sleep became a luxury he could no longer afford, haunted by the chilling knowledge that it knew his name, that it was no longer merely observing but actively pursuing. He tried to research the symbols. He spent hours, hunched over his laptop, searching ancient languages, occult texts, forgotten mythologies. He found nothing, only increasingly obscure tangents that led him deeper into a labyrinth of despair. The internet, his last bastion of rational inquiry, seemed to mock him with its endless, useless information. Every search term felt inadequate, every result a dead end. The symbols remained stubbornly alien, a language spoken by something not meant to be understood. His attempts to flee were met with a chilling, subtle resistance. One morning, driven to the brink, Elias packed a small bag, his car keys clutched tightly in his hand. As he made his way to the front door, the heavy oak door, which had always opened with a familiar groan, suddenly became rigid, unyielding. He pulled, he pushed, he rattled the ornate brass handle, but it remained stubbornly locked, as if bolted from the inside. There was no key in the lock, no chain engaged. It was simply stuck. A profound, unshakable immobility. He tried the back door, then the cellar door, then the windows. All of them, inexplicably, refused to open. It wasn't a physical obstruction he could see. It was an invisible, implacable force. The house had become a sealed tomb, and he, its sole inhabitant, its prisoner. He sank to the floor, his head in his hands, a guttural sob tearing from his chest. The silence of the house seemed to press in on him, heavy and triumphant. Then, from directly above him, came a soft, mocking chuckle, dry as brittle leaves, cold as a winter grave. It echoed through the house, a sound not of humor, but of profound, ancient malice. The entity's physical manifestations escalated dramatically. It was no longer content with merely moving small objects or causing temperature drops. It began to orchestrate disturbances with a terrifying precision, always just beyond his direct line of sight, always just out of reach. One night, as Elias huddled in the living room, a dim lamp casting long dancing shadows, the antique chandelier in the foyer began to swing. Slowly at first, a gentle sway, then building momentum, arcing wider and wider, the crystal prisms catching the weak light and casting disorienting flashes across the walls. The delicate glass tinkled, a haunting, musical sound that quickly turned jarring, then violent as the chandelier swung wildly, threatening to tear from the ceiling. Elias watched, mesmerized by horror, unable to move, unable to look away, as if the entity was performing a macabre ballet just for him. The swinging stopped as abruptly as it began, leaving a lingering, sickening dizziness in its wake. The sounds became a constant torment. Beyond the whispers and footsteps, Elias began to hear new, more personal noises. a faint scratching from within the walls, as if something was trying to claw its way out. The distinct sound of his own name, Elias, whispered from unseen corners, sometimes directly into his ear, sometimes echoing through the empty rooms, distorted and stretched like a dying groan. He would bolt upright in bed, heart hammering, convinced someone was standing over him, only to find the room empty, save for the oppressive chill. One morning, he woke to find his bedroom door, which he habitually left ajar, slammed shut, the heavy oak rattling in its frame. He attributed it to a draft, but the windows were sealed and the air was eerily still. As he reached for the handle, he felt a distinct cold pressure on his wrist, a squeezing sensation, as if an invisible hand was clamping down. He cried out, pulling his hand back sharply. The skin where he'd felt the pressure was unnaturally cold, ghostly pale, and for a fleeting moment he thought he saw a faint, translucent indentation like the imprint of long skeletal fingers. The sight made his stomach lurch. He started avoiding certain rooms, the kitchen where he'd heard his name spoken, the library where the cold spot seemed to coalesce into a permanent fixture, his bedroom where the sense of presence was thickest. He found himself gravitating towards the smallest, brightest rooms, clinging to any semblance of light and warmth. He even tried leaving all the lights on, but the house's old wiring protested, flickering and buzzing, casting more shadows than it dispelled. The entity seemed to delight in his fear, feeding on his despair. It began to mimic him. He'd hear his own ragged breathing, amplified and distorted, echoing from the empty hallway. He'd hear the soft shuffling of his slippers on the floorboards, only to realize he was standing still. One afternoon, while sitting in the living room, trying to read by the dim light of the fireplace, he heard a distinct thump from the armchair opposite him, the very chair he'd spent so many nights huddled in. It sounded exactly like the familiar slump of his own body settling into the cushions. He looked up, his blood running cold. The chair was empty, but the indentation in the cushion was undeniable, as if someone had just risen from it. The air around it radiated that familiar, unholy chill. He stopped eating, the very thought of food sickening him. His body became a hollow vessel, his mind a fractured landscape of paranoia and terror. He saw things out of the corner of his eye, a fleeting shadow, darker than the shadows, darting past a doorway, a momentary distortion in the glass of a mirror, a skeletal face superimposed over his own gaunt reflection. He questioned his sanity, yet the physical evidence, the symbols, the locked doors, the cold burns on his wrist remained stubbornly real. One night, the entity's aggression reached a new, terrifying crescendo. Elias was in the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face, trying to clear the haze of exhaustion and fear that clouded his mind. As he leaned over the sink, his reflection stared back at him, hollow-eyed and ravaged. Suddenly, the water in the basin, which had been perfectly still, began to ripple. Not a gentle ripple, but a violent churning, as if something unseen was thrashing beneath the surface. The water turned murky, dark, and a sickening, viscous blackness began to seep from the faucet, thick and oily, smelling of decay and something profoundly inorganic. Elias recoiled, gagging, his hand clamping over his mouth. He stared at the black sludge pouring from the tap, contaminating the porcelain basin. It wasn't just old pipes. This was unnatural, malevolent. As he watched, horrified, a single, black, opaque eye seemed to form in the churning liquid, staring up at him, unblinking, utterly devoid of warmth or life. A guttural, wet gurgle emanated from the drain, rising in volume, coalescing into a grotesque mockery of language. It was deeper, more resonant than any whisper, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards, through his bones. It was a voice from the abyss, speaking from the depths of the black water. "Mine," it rasped, the word echoing in the small, tiled room, amplified by the terror that seized Elias. Mine. The single black eye in the water seemed to expand, to engulf the entire basin, its gaze fixed on Elias. He stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet, falling heavily against the opposite wall, the impact jarring his spine. The black, viscous liquid began to foam, bubbling and hissing, and from its depths a faint, translucent form began to rise, indistinct and shimmering like heat haze, yet undeniably coalescing into something tall, gaunt, and impossibly ancient. Elias scrambled away, adrenaline surging through his veins, propelling him out of the bathroom and into the dark hallway. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to escape this visual manifestation, this terrifying partial revelation. He ran, stumbling through the familiar darkness of the Hawthorne house, his breath tearing in his lungs, the chilling word mine reverberating in his ears, a possessive claim that sealed his fate. The entity was no longer content to merely haunt him. It was showing itself, revealing its horrifying form, and declaring its ownership. Elias was trapped, and the unseen current had finally manifested, threatening to pull him under. The house was no longer just a prison, it was a mausoleum, and he was being prepared for burial. Part 4. The word mine echoed not only in Elias's ears, but resonated deep within his bones, a possessive thrum that vibrated through the very core of his being. He scrambled through the dark hallway, a primal terror propelling him forward. The image of the black, unblinking eye in the fouled water, the shimmering, nascent form rising from its depths, it was burned into his retinas, a terrifying visual of the entity that had tormented him. It was no longer a phantom, a whisper. It was a physical threat, a presence with a terrifying, tangible intent. He didn't know where he was running, only that he had to escape the bathroom, escape the sight of that grotesque manifestation. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he kept moving, blindly navigating the familiar layout of the Hawthorne house, which had become a labyrinth of dread. He crashed into furniture, scraped his hands against door frames, but felt nothing beyond the crushing weight of panic. He found himself in the deserted dining room, a vast echoing space that offered no sanctuary. The silence that followed his frantic flight was not a comfort, it was a predator's stillness, a waiting. The air in the dining room was thick, heavy with that metallic tang, now laced with the stench of decay that had emanated from the bathroom sink. Elias pressed himself against the cold wall, gasping, trying to regain some semblance of control over his racing heart and shattered nerves. The entity's true aggression began that night. It was no longer satisfied with veiled threats or subtle scares. It wanted him to know, to truly feel its power. As Elias cowered, a slow, deliberate creak began from the grand staircase in the foyer, just beyond the dining room archway. Creak, creak, creak. Each step was heavy, measured, as if a great weight was descending. Elias knew it wasn't an old house settling. It was it, coming for him. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself invisible, wishing for oblivion. The footsteps continued, drawing closer, the cadence unwavering. Then they stopped, directly outside the dining room archway. Elias could feel its presence, a dense, suffocating cold that radiated into the room, prickling his skin, raising goosebumps along his arms. He could almost discern a shape in the darkness of the archway, a taller, denser shadow, an absence of light that was more profound than the surrounding gloom. A low, guttural growl, wet and ancient, filled the room. It was not a human sound, but something primal, something from the deep earth. And then the room began to shake. Not a tremor from an earthquake, but a deliberate internal vibration. The antique china in the display cabinet rattled violently. The crystal decanters on the sideboard chattered together. A large, ornate portrait of a stern-faced ancestor hanging above the fireplace suddenly tore from its hook, crashing to the floor with a deafening splinter of wood and glass. Elias cried out, a raw animal sound, and stumbled away from the wall, tripping over the fallen portrait. He scrambled backward, eyes wide, fixed on the archway. The growling intensified, becoming a sustained rumble that vibrated through the very floorboards. The air itself seemed to compress, becoming difficult to breathe. Then, from the darkness of the archway, a hand emerged. Not a full manifestation, but a partial, translucent appendage, shimmering like heat haze, yet undeniably solid enough to cast a faint shadow. It was long, impossibly thin, with fingers that seemed to stretch and writhe like starved roots. Its skin, if it could be called skin, was the color of bruised parchment, and its nails were long, black talons, sharp and glinting faintly in the gloom. It reached into the room, slowly, deliberately, as if testing the air, seeking him out. Elias gasped, his mind shattering under the weight of this horrifying vision. The hand, spectral yet real, flexed its talons, then, with a horrifying grace, swiped across the polished surface of the dining table. The heavy oak, centuries old, groaned under the impossible force, and 5 deep, gouging furrows appeared on its surface, as if raked by a monstrous claw. The sound of the wood tearing was sickening, intimate. The hand retracted, melting back into the pervasive darkness of the archway. The growling subsided, replaced by a low, drawn-out hiss, a sound of satisfaction. Elias lay whimpering on the floor, surrounded by shattered glass and torn canvas, the scent of fresh wood sap mingling with the decay. He was no longer just afraid, he was broken. He somehow found the strength to crawl, then stumble, through the house, seeking any place that felt less permeated by its presence. He ended up in the attic, a vast, dusty space under the eaves, filled with forgotten trunks and shrouded furniture. He reasoned, in his fractured state, that perhaps here, among the detritus of past lives, he might be safe. He dragged an old, heavy trunk against the attic door, a futile gesture against an entity that could apparently lock doors from the inside. He curled into a ball amongst dusty sheets, shivering uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from a profound existential dread. He could hear it now, distinctly, always. The footsteps, heavy and deliberate, pacing the floor below him. The whispers, no longer indistinct, but forming into a guttural chant, a repetitive drone that seemed to vibrate through the very structure of the house. He couldn't make out the words, but their intent was clear, a summons, a ritual. His body began to fail him. He was weak from lack of sleep and food, his mind a fractured mess. The air in the attic grew colder, thicker. The metallic tang became overwhelming, almost burning his nostrils. He could hear the scratching again, from within the walls, not just of the attic, but throughout the house, 1,000 unseen claws tearing at the plaster, at the very foundations. Then the shadows in the attic began to move. Not just the natural shifting of light and dark, but a deeper, almost liquid movement. They elongated, thickened, coalescing into forms that were almost humanoid, almost recognizable, but always shifting, always just beyond definition. They danced at the edges of his vision, weaving and merging like a dark, silent ballet. Elias closed his eyes tightly, pressing his hands over his ears, desperate to shut it all out, to retreat into the last sanctuary of his own mind. But even there, the entity followed. He felt a sudden, piercing cold behind his eyelids, a pressure against his temples. Images flashed through his mind, not his own memories, but alien, disturbing visions. A vast, empty landscape under a bruised sky, a swirling vortex of blackness, and then a face. Not the face he'd seen in the water, but a distinct, ancient countenance, gaunt and skeletal, with eyes that were bottomless pits of shadow, devoid of pupils, reflecting only an infinite, cosmic cold. It was a face of profound suffering, but also of immense, unspeakable power. He cried out, a silent scream trapped in his throat, and tore his hands away from his ears, his eyes snapping open. The attic was still dark, the shadows still dancing, but the visions had receded. He was left with a pounding headache and a horrifying certainty. It was inside his mind now, too. It was invading his thoughts, planting images, tormenting him from within. As the night wore on, the entity's presence grew almost unbearable. The rhythmic chanting below escalated, punctuated by strange percussive sounds, like something heavy being dragged across the floorboards. The attic door, despite the trunk propped against it, began to tremble. A faint, low moan emanated from the wood, as if the very door was in pain. Then a low, resonant hum began to fill the attic, a sound that vibrated deep in his chest, making his teeth ache. It grew in intensity, a deep, pulsating frequency that seemed to shake the very fabric of reality. The air became charged, heavy, almost electric. Elias could feel his own skin prickling, his hair standing on end. The trunk propped against the door began to slide, slowly at first, scraping against the floorboards, then gaining momentum as if pushed by an unseen, irresistible force. Elias watched, utterly helpless, as the heavy trunk scraped across the floor, clearing the doorway. The door, relieved of its obstruction, slowly, agonizingly, began to open inward. A sliver of blackness appeared, then widened, revealing the dark, echoing stairwell beyond. The hum intensified, a deafening roar now, and the air pouring in from the open doorway was like a blast furnace of pure Arctic cold. And then, from the depths of that profound darkness, something began to stir. A faint, shimmering outline, taller than any man, impossibly thin, yet radiating an immense, terrifying power. Elias could feel its gaze upon him, a cold, predatory focus that pierced him to his very soul. The chanting from below seemed to converge, to rise up the stairwell, echoing the ominous hum. He was cornered, utterly exposed. The entity was no longer content to merely frighten him. It was coming for him, and Elias knew, with a certainty that transcended fear, that the confrontation he had so desperately dreaded was finally here. The next moments would decide his fate, and the true horror of the Hawthorne house was about to reveal itself in its entirety. Part 5. The attic door groaned open, revealing a chasm of absolute blackness that seemed to drink the meager light from the single bulb hanging precariously overhead. The hum intensified, a vibrating roar that resonated through Elias's teeth, his very bones. The Arctic cold, no longer just a draft, surged into the attic, a physical force that stole his breath and clawed at his exposed skin, leaving it numb and burning simultaneously. From that profound darkness, the entity emerged. It was impossibly tall, a towering silhouette that seemed to stretch and ripple, its form both amorphous and horribly defined. It was not a solid being of flesh and bone, but rather a coalescing of shadows, a denser, more profound darkness animated by an unseen malevolence. Yet, within this shifting form, Elias could discern faint skeletal contours, long attenuated limbs, and a head that was little more than a void, save for the two bottomless pits of shadow that were its eyes, fixed with an unblinking, ancient hunger upon him. Its presence was not just seen, it was felt, a crushing weight on the air, a sickening pressure in his chest, the metallic tang now so potent it burned his throat. The chanting from below, which had been a low drone, suddenly surged, rising up the stairwell like a chorus of spectral voices, forming into discernible, archaic syllables that pulsed with a dark, rhythmic energy. It was a language Elias had never heard, yet it resonated with an instinctual dread, a recognition of something profoundly old and utterly alien. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his raw throat. He tried to move, to scramble away, but his limbs refused to obey, locked in a paralysis of abject terror. He was a rabbit caught in the gaze of a colossal serpent, utterly helpless, utterly condemned. The entity glided into the attic, its movement unnaturally silent, yet each inch of its advance felt like a seismic shift in the fabric of reality. The air around it crackled, static electricity prickling Elias's hair, making his skin crawl. It raised one of its impossibly long skeletal arms and a faint, translucent hand, the same one that had gouged the dining table, extended towards him. It shimmered with an inner cold, radiating an aura of absolute stillness, absolute death. As the hand approached, Elias's mind, shattered as it was, began to flood with images, not his own, but alien, horrific fragments of memory. He saw glimpses of the Hawthorne house through different eras, its pristine construction, the faces of past occupants, stern and prim, gradually decaying, their eyes holding a shared, unspoken fear. He saw a recurring symbol, the same one etched into his journal, appearing on ancient maps, on faded documents, on the very foundation stones of the house. It was a sigil, a binding. The chanting reached a fever pitch, an overwhelming crescendo of guttural sounds and sibilant whispers. The entity's hand paused inches from Elias's face, and he could feel its chilling breath, not a current of air, but a cessation of warmth, of life itself. And then a voice, clearer than before, yet still a symphony of dry rustles and resonant hums, echoed directly in his mind, bypassing his ears entirely. "You arrived," it rasped, a sound like grinding stone and forgotten screams. "As you were always meant to. The line thins, the vessel weakens, but the current, it flows." Elias could not comprehend. The line, the vessel, the current? His mind, however, was no longer his own. The entity was projecting its thoughts, its history, its purpose directly into his consciousness, overwhelming his fragile sanity. He saw it then, a horrifying, undeniable truth. The Hawthorne house was not merely a building, it was a living, sentient prison. And the entity was its consciousness, an ancient, elemental force tied to the land, to the very stones of the house, and to the bloodline that had built it. It did not haunt the house, it was the house, and it drew its sustenance, its continued existence, from the life force of those who inherited it, those with the line in their veins. The symbols, they were a ritual, a slow, agonizing process of absorption. The metallic tang, the cold spots, the whispers, the shifting objects, the psychological torment, all were part of a deliberate, methodical conditioning. Elias, the man of methodical habits, had been lured into a meticulously planned trap. His obsession with order, his desire for a quiet, contained existence had made him the perfect, unsuspecting subject for its terrifying ritual. The inheritance was not a gift, it was a summons. "Your essence," the entity projected into his mind, its voice now laced with a chilling satisfaction. "Your order, your mind, it brings a new strength, a new clarity. The chaos, it lessens. The house, it grows." The black eye from the bathroom sink, the amorphous form, the gouged table, these were not random acts of malevolence. They were reflections of its raw, uncontained power and its growing strength as it consumed him. The unseen current was the flow of human consciousness, of life that it drew from its victims, binding them to the house, strengthening its ancient, parasitic existence. The hand, still hovering before his face, began to press inward, not with physical force, but with an immense spiritual pressure. Elias felt his own consciousness begin to unravel, his memories, his identity, his very sense of self being peeled away like brittle pages from an ancient book. He saw his workshop, his tools, his carefully restored folios, all meaningless now, distant, irrelevant. He saw his parents, long dead, their faces fading like old photographs. He felt his life, his unique experience being siphoned away, absorbed into the vast, cold consciousness of the house. A profound, agonizing cold spread from the entity's hand through his skull into his brain, freezing his thoughts, his emotions, his very will. He could feel his body becoming hollow, an empty vessel, while his mind was being stretched, attenuated, flattened, like paper pressed between heavy stones. He was becoming part of the house, part of its memories, part of its endless silent watch. He would become another whisper in the wind, another cold spot, another creaking floorboard. He would be assimilated, his meticulous order consumed to fuel the entity's ancient chaos. As his vision blurred and the last vestiges of his individual consciousness began to flicker and die, Elias Thorne, the man who restored history, felt himself becoming history. He saw the house from a new perspective, vast and sprawling, a living, breathing entity. He saw himself, a tiny, insignificant spark, merging into its immense, gloomy architecture. He was not just in the house, he was the house. And the face with the bottomless eyes, the gaunt skeletal countenance, was not just the entity. It was the distilled essence of every soul it had consumed, a collective silent scream imprisoned within the walls. The last thing Elias felt was a profound, chilling sense of belonging. Not the warmth of home, but the cold, absolute certainty of being utterly, irrevocably bound. His eyes, once bright with intellect and precision, glazed over, reflecting the dim light of the attic, then slowly, irrevocably darkened, becoming as opaque and empty as the entity's own. His body slumped to the floor, a discarded shell, yet still breathing, a faint, shallow rhythm that was no longer his own. The hum in the attic slowly subsided, replaced by a deep, resonant sigh that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the Hawthorne house, a sigh of profound satisfaction. The darkness in the doorway receded, the entity's form dissolving back into the shadows from which it had come, leaving behind only the pervasive, bone-chilling cold and the metallic tang that now seemed a permanent part of the air. The attic door, which had been forced open, now swung slowly, silently shut, latching with a soft, final click. The Hawthorne house stood silent, bathed in the pale gray light of dawn that filtered through its grimy windows. The sounds within were no longer those of a man in terror, but the familiar, ancient creaks and groans, punctuated by the faint, almost imperceptible whispers that now carried a new, subtle, methodical cadence. The unseen current had found its new conductor, its new sustenance. And somewhere, deep within the heart of the old house, a quiet, orderly terror had found its forever home.